I now invite to stage the author of the Colonial Constitution, Arghya Sengupta, and Badapbiang Dkhar, who will be in conversation with Arghya. Arghya Sengupta is the founder and research director of Vidhi Center for Legal Policy, New Delhi. He was educated at the National Law School of India, University Bengaluru, and the University of Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar and lecturer in law. Badapbiang Tariang Dkhar is a research fellow at National Law University, Meghalaya.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And I think the previous session was a lot of fun, with poetry. And now we have a talk on the Constitution of India.
We'll try to make that fun too.
Yes, of course. And to, avoid legal jargon as much as possible and to make this, a simple talk, a conversation between friends. And I'm so happy to meet you again over here, to share the panel. And I would like to congratulate you on your new book, An Origin Story, The Colonial Constitution. So welcome to Shillong. I'm so happy that you're here.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here in such a beautiful setting.
Yes. So to begin with, today we have quite a mixed audience, across different disciplines and with different experiences. Some people, the introduction to the Constitution have been through their civics books, and some might be legal scholars who are within our midst. So, while teaching constitutional law, especially to young children, I always tell them it is the grandparent of all laws, which serves as a guide to our rights and civil liberties. So, if I may I call you Argo?
Yes,
I
certainly.
hope I'm pronouncing it right. Before going into the merits of your book, so can you just tell us a little bit, in a nutshell, to inform the audience about our Constitution. So in a nutshell, just before we begin with your book.
Yeah, thanks very much, Badapbiang. It's lovely to be here, and I'm trying to not be a dampener by talking too much law. So I'm glad that you asked me a simple question to begin with. I think the Constitution of India, unfortunately for most of us here, was introduced to us through our civics textbooks in school. And at least for me, the civics textbooks in school were the most boring textbooks that one could ever read. And this is one thing that I certainly didn't want to read at all. But when it got to a little bit further, around class 11 and 12, that's when I realized that when I became more politically aware, and we're talking about 2001, 2002, that's when you realize that a lot of what you see around you has a lot to do with constitutional law. So for example, Delhi is the most polluted city in the world. And the reason it's the most polluted city in the world, apart from a many range of things, is because of the fact that the right to clean air, which is a constitutionally guaranteed right, is not enforced at all. Number one. Number two, if you were to take another example, if you were to look at the debates around the Citizenship Amendment Act, who is a citizen of India? What answers that question? And that's the Constitution. So the idea of the Constitution, and you've put it beautifully, is that it's our grandparent. It's someone who's always there to guide us. May not be like a parent who's there every day and telling us to do this and do that, but who's always there in the background guiding us. And I think it's important, and that's why I wrote this book, that I think it's important for everyone to engage with the Constitution. Because, sometimes we get a sense that the Constitution is like this, like a holy book, which is to be venerated. And I completely disagree with that. I think it's actually a document that has to be engaged with, it has to be critiqued, it has to be discussed and debated, and not just by lawyers and in courtrooms. And I think that's the key part. We often feel that, and I hear this a lot, and I'm sure you do too, that whenever it comes to a question of law, people say, oh, that's for the lawyers, or that's for the judges, And actually, and this is what my book is trying to say, that law is about the ordinary citizen. It is about you and me. It is about the air we breathe. It is about who we consider a citizen of India. It is about a range of other things. And I think that's what law is. And the idea behind the book is for citizens to engage with the Constitution in a simple and accessible manner.
All right. It's true that, like, while I've read your book, it is quite simple to understand. So, would you classify your book as an academic book, or under what genre would you put it under? And I would just like to address what you had mentioned just now. You had said that the right to clean air, of course, is a constitutional right, and we all, as lawyers, we know that it's under the directive principles of state policy. But however, our constitution is a transformative one. And via, public interest litigation, in the case of MC Mehta versus Union of India, it has transformed to say that, yes, we do have the right to clean air, to clean environment. So in that sense, even though it's not explicitly written, but our constitution is transformative. So could you please elaborate on the first part, which is, our constitution? This book, is it an academic one, since you have many academic points and it's very historical?
Yeah.
Yes.
I would say that this book is not for an academic audience at all. So if there are hardcore legal academics here, then I think this book would possibly disappoint you. This book is written for an engaged lay audience, because as I said in my answer to the first question, the impulse behind writing this book is to try and ensure that every citizen of India engages with the Constitution. And the fact is that we all have a kind of very hazy understanding of what the Constitution is, but and we know that it has a set of fundamental rights and it has some directive principles. But let me make it real. Since I'm sitting in Shillong, and with your permission, this is an area that is under the 6th schedule and part of the Scheduled Areas Act. So one of the things that my book partly goes into is that there were several debates in the Constituent Assembly when it was being decided as to what would happen with tribal areas. Tribal areas were earlier called excluded areas or partially excluded areas. And Jaipal Singh Munda was a major tribal leader who was in the Constituent Assembly, and he had declared that the idea of an excluded area, he said, is like a zoo created by the British. And he said, how long will we continue with this kind of idea? We have to think for ourselves as to where we strike this balance between assimilation and integration. And he also said, but he didn't belabor the point, because he said something very interesting, which is that he said that I am very happy and I am reassured by the fact that the Constituent Assembly has Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru as part of its midst, and he will certainly protect the interest of tribals. We just celebrated Nehru's birthday yesterday, and I think it's become quite fashionable to critique Nehru, so I think a good word for Nehru is in order. And that's what Jaipal Singh Munda had said at that point of time. And today, we are 75 years on. We can see in neighboring Manipur, which is not a scheduled area, we can see disputes between the Kukis and the Métis, and we can see how that's playing out, which is essentially something that played out at the time of the Constitution as well. How are hill tribes going to live with plains people? And these are issues that every generation has to consider for itself. Now, the Constitution made certain choices in 1950, and the choice was to make parts of Meghalaya a scheduled area, some other parts, but Manipur was not made a scheduled area at that point of time. And so I think that every generation needs to think for itself about the Constitution. And with this book, what I've tried to do is not so much make an academic argument of what the Constitution should be like, but what I'm more interested in doing is trying to provoke you to think for yourselves about the Constitution, whether you agree with the book's arguments or not.
All right. So, a little bit when I was reading your book, I was a little bit disappointed.
I said academics would be disappointed.
So I was a little bit disappointed that you did not address, say, like the 6th schedule per se in detail. as with mainstream India, mostly whenever there are talks and when we are being taught the constitution, we are never taught the sixth schedule at all. I think you can agree with me in that. You know, whether it's NLSIU or NLU Jodhpur, where where constitution is being taught, we're never taught that part. So, we have J.J.M. Nichols Roy, who was the architect of the sixth schedule. So why did you not touch upon that? Because you had heavily criticized the constitution framers, the constitutional law framers, stating that they did not include a Panchayati Raj system. They did not talk about decentralization. Okay, it only came about in 1993. And you highly criticized that, but you did not speak about the contributions of J.J.M. Nichols Roy as a man, a hill tribesman from the state of Meghalaya. So
that's right.
Yes.
So I think, first of all, as in, you're absolutely right that the sixth schedule doesn't, or the fifth schedule for that matter, doesn't form a part of mainstream constitutional teaching, and the sixth schedule deals with mostly tribal areas in the northeast, and the fifth schedule deals with tribal areas in central India. And I think that criticism is warranted, that I didn't deal with those questions, and that's, again, there's a very simple reason for that, is that I wanted this book to be non-technical and I wanted this to be an easy read. So it clocks in at 216 pages, and now you've given me a good reason to write a sequel. So hopefully the publishers will agree to do that. But on the point of J.J. Nichols Roy, and I think this is a great point that you made, I may be getting this date wrong, but in July 1947 in Shillong was the final meeting of the Excluded and Partially Excluded Areas Committee. That committee had Mr. Nichols Roy, or Reverend Nichols Roy, as a member, and Gopinath Bordoloi was the chairperson of that committee. And there they took a decision that was, in my view at that point of time, an extremely wise one, which is that they would continue the local tribal councils in most of the six scheduled areas. There would be some subjects which would be legislated by the state government, then the Assam government, but several subjects, particularly those relating to primary school, primary health care, would have to be done in consonance with the consent of the local hill council. So there's a great story there in terms of the Scheduled Areas Act, as in I'm guilty as charged, but maybe that's one for a sequel.
All right. On a light-hearted note, okay, you have received quite raving reviews from jurists and lawyers. I would just like to read that out. I know I could have done this at the beginning, but nonetheless, I want to read them out.
Always nice to hear it.
So, your book, An Origin Story. So basically, it's about the origin of the Constitution, the constitutional law debates that happen, and the socio-political scenario of the time. You have gotten great reviews from, say, Justice B.N. Sri Krishna, who've stated, an in-depth survey of the evolution and development of the Indian Constitution. This book is a must-read for serious students of constitutional jurisprudence. And then we have Harish Salve, who's a famous taxation lawyer, who says, an invaluable read for not just lawyers and students of constitutional law, but also those who are in government needing to develop a sense of constitutional values. So the words that are used here, they're quite heavy and they sound very academic, Mr. Orgo. So how can you say that this is not an academic book when you have heavily researched, and I can see, you have put a lot of thought into it, and you've come up with quotes from B.N. Rao to B.R. Ambedkar, and they've been beautifully mentioned in your book. So how can you say that it's not academic and it's simple, where even for me as an I'll call myself a law student still, it's quite heavy. Yeah.
Right. So first up is that I didn't write those lines. Justice Sri Krishna and Mr. Salve wrote them, and I'm very, very, very grateful for them. Also, I hope that those are the toughest parts of the book to read. But you're right, as in I'll be perfectly upfront and say that I come from a legal academic background, so it's possible to take me away from academics, but perhaps not take the academic away from me entirely. So it's not as if this book is not making an argument. If what we mean by academic is that, is it making an argument? Yes, it is making an argument. And the argument that is making is a very simple one, that our constitution in several parts is a colonial document. And why do I say it's a colonial document? For three key reasons. One is that it continues colonial institutions. So if you take let's take the Indian Police Service. The Indian Police Service was earlier the Imperial Police Service, which was single-handedly responsible for most of the brutality of the British Raj. But when it came to 1947, and what do we do with the Imperial Police Service? There were many comments that came into the Constituent Assembly that you must abolish it. You must have local police, you must have community policing. These were ideas that were thrown about. But at that point of time, a simple decision was taken, which, as you can see, has a legacy that has continued to this day, is that let's change the name. So we changed the name from the Imperial Police Service to the Indian Police Service. Name changing is something that has continued for a very long time. And it was enshrined constitutionally as Article 312 of the Constitution. So we continued colonial institutions, number one. Number two, we must say this, and we must not be afraid to criticize parts of the Constitution that don't work. I mean, there are many parts that work beautifully. You mentioned the fundamental rights, parts of them, but some parts don't work. So for example, why is the Constitution so long? If you were to go back to our civics textbooks, it always used to start with this line that the Indian Constitution is the longest constitution in the world. Now, I didn't know whether to feel happy about that or sad, because I don't know what exactly was meant except for a matter of fact. But why is it so long? And there is a deeper reason as to why it's long. Because framer after framer say in the Constituent Assembly that the Indian people are not ready for democracy. Now, whether that's right or wrong is a debatable point. We can discuss it later, but this is the view. So, what must we do? We must write out everything about governance in excruciating detail in the Constitution so that it is not left to the people. In my view, that is a belief that started with the colonists, that the natives cannot be trusted. And now we say the people aren't ready for democracy. And this is why we have such a long constitution where there are very minor details that are provided. So that's the second reason why I say it's constitutional. And the third is that we have tremendous fundamental rights that have been provided to us by the Constitution. But at the same time, it's my view, as I've written in the book, that we have set up a law and order state. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that this is a state which has huge amount of police power. We till today, and this is no disrespect to any policeman, but the fact is that as citizens, we are afraid of the police. As in, I'm a lawyer and I don't want necessarily to have an interaction with a policeman. It's always seen as a hostile interaction. And why does that happen? Because the Constitution itself preserves large amounts of police power. So if I were to take an example, Article 21 of the Constitution is the right to life and personal liberty. It's the most fundamental of fundamental rights. Now that too has an exception, and the exception is preventive detention. Now what do we mean by that? That the police can, if they suspect that someone might be committing a crime, they can pick them up and preventively detain them. So no arrest, no FIR, no charge sheet, no charge, so no formal legal process. Now this is provided for as an exception to the right to life and personal liberty in the Constitution. And this is not a theoretical matter. If you look at the data from last year, all over India, there were 58 lakh people who were arrested. By arrested, I mean under the IPC, there was some investigation and arrest happened. But in comparison, there were 86.6 lakh people who were detained. That is essentially the police comes, picks them up, puts them in, maybe for a couple of days, 2-3 days, and then gets them out again. But essentially on the whims and fancies of a policeman. So I think that these are the arguments, which you may call an academic arguments, that the book makes in terms of why it's colonial. But I've tried to do that in as simple a form as possible.
In your book, you've also said that it's colonial because it has been borrowed from largely parts of the Constitution have been borrowed from the Government of India Act 1935. So the bare bones may be from the Government of India Act 1935, which is obviously colonial. But just because the bare bones are colonial does not mean that the flesh and the spirit, of the Constitution is colonial. So you have mentioned, of course, there are certain things such as preventive detention that's there under the Constitution, and one may ask, why is it there, even though most of the framers were actually jailed and imprisoned, right? But however, we have to look at the political and socio-economic climate of the time. So, so that there is not a misreading of our Constitution. I feel that the audience and, I can see my students here as well, so that they know that, all right? And you've said that the Colonial Constitution is the story of why a group of freedom-loving Indians who have liberated themselves after 2 centuries of colonial rule chose to compose this so-called music of an English band and call it the Constitution of India. It is a tale of texts that they looked up to as models and contexts of the fluid nature of Indian politics at the time of the country's independence and partition. It features the most outstanding political leaders of the generation, displaying both exalted erudition and banal sentiment, dashes of originality, interspersed with episodes of cautious copying. It is neither a celebration of the Constitution nor a critique. It is an origin story that begins on the morning of April Fool's Day, 1937. In a way, you are saying that, yes, the Constitution has been largely, borrowed. I will not use the word copying because I feel that it is not wrong to use best practices from other time-tested constitutions. For instance, the United States of America was once upon a time colonized, and so was Ireland. And yet, our constitutional law framers, even B.N. Rao, had read over 60 constitutions in order to come about with the constitution that we have today, which is a protector of rights. So how can you just, isn't it a little bit reductive to say that, it's interspersed with episodes of cautious copying when, so is it wrong to use best practices from elsewhere? Is that the point that you're trying to make?
No, not at all. Actually, I think there's a beautiful quote by Baba Saheb Ambedkar which says that we are, and I'm paraphrasing here, is that we are drafting this constitution about 200 years after the first constitution was drafted. So if I've copied something from somewhere else, then I'm proud of that fact. And he's absolutely right, is that there's absolutely nothing wrong in borrowing things from other places, even copying them if something has worked. And there's nothing wrong in that at all. And as I've said, is that this is an origin story about the Constitution. And there are things where there are dashes of originality and there are episodes of cautious copying. And the quote that Badapbiang partly read out was a quote by Kengal Hanumantayya, who was the first chief minister of Mysore state and a member of the Constituent Assembly. Now, Hanumantayya was an avid Gandhian. And as an avid Gandhian in the Constituent Assembly, when he was making a speech at the end, he was quite disappointed. He was disappointed because the Constitution, when he looked at it, didn't contain any Gandhian precepts. What were Gandhian precepts in the Constitution? The idea of duties were not present in the constitutional framework. The idea of decentralization, of villages as units of democracy, was not present in the Constitution. And there were other ideas in relation to prohibition of cow slaughter, cottage industry, which were prohibition, which were all Gandhian ideas, which were not present in the Constitution. So Hanumantayya said that we came here, and this is a quote, we came here to hear the music of the veena and the sitar, but what we find is the music of an English band. And this was his quote, which was an overriding sentiment that was prevalent amongst members of the Constituent Assembly. So the argument that I've made is that by all means we can borrow from here and there, and wherever provisions have worked, if it has worked, if it can be adapted to India, by all means we can borrow from there. But at the same time, the fundamental question that we must ask, and we must continue to ask today, is what does India need? in relation to this matter, not what is the position in A, B or C country and how can I adapt that in India. And I've worked a lot with governments over the course of the last 10 years, and we often find that how do we make laws in this country? We say, oh, let's see what's happening in the UK, let's see what's happening in the US, and then let's try and adapt it to our situation. And that's where I have a fundamental problem, where I believe that we must first answer the question, what problem are we trying to solve in India? And I think that's where the key issue is. And with the constituent framers, as there is a reason as to why they chose the Government of India Act 1935 as the base draft, is because they were on a clock. Like we are on a clock, they were given a very limited amount of time to frame this constitution. They didn't have the opportunity to start off on a clean slate. So they started with the Government of India Act, which the British had enacted in 1935, and then they started making modifications from there. So there is a practical exigency as to why they did that. But when we, 75 years on today, think about the constitution and the choices that were made, I think we must not at all, and this is never my intention to disrespect or belittle any of the framers. They absolutely wanted the best thing for India. But today, if we want the best thing for India, then we have to think for ourselves as to what the constitution ought to be. If it is a continuation of what it is today, fine, let's continue it, but let's think about it. Because if we don't think about it, then I worry that it becomes a kind of holy book that no one engages with.
All right, yes. As a law student, we do see the Constitution as a holy book, and very rightly, it is a holy book, because without the Constitution, then we wouldn't have, we wouldn't have the rights that we have today. And like I said before, it is a transformative constitution. And for instance, in your book, you did mention, earlier under British rule, we were under, a colonial government, and we didn't even have citizenship for that instance, okay? Neither did we have the autonomous district councils. And, we were subjects of the British Empire. And at the same time, we did not have the right to vote. We did not have many of those rights, but it was because of the Constitution that we have the rights today. And because of the Constitution, we are a secular state. And if you look at our neighbors, for instance, I will not name our neighbors, but you know who they are. Their constitution and their, government, it's failing. In the sense that now you have a military coup, and you have the military that is ruling these governments, but because of our constitution, we have been able to protect all of those rights and to ensure that a tyrant does not come into power to dictate, our everyday, right? So in a sense, the constitution has protected our rights in that sense.
Actually, this is a point where, with the greatest respect, I disagree with you. I think if you look at the constitution, and we can name our neighbors, we can look at the constitution of Pakistan. It's a great constitution. It's very beautifully written. It's almost very similar to the constitution of India in many parts. The preamble, they've got a very similar kind of preamble to India. They've got fundamental rights. It's similar in many respects. But as you've rightly pointed out, is that the state, the governance machinery in that state is perhaps not doing as well. So the reason why that's the case is not because of a constitution. A constitution is the crystallization of the political culture. Why is India a secular country? It's not because of the constitution, it's because of a secular freedom movement. That's why India is a secular country, because of what Gandhiji gave us. That is why India is secular. The constitution tries to capture that secularism. And tomorrow someone might come and change that if the political culture changes. So what is critical is the political culture. So India is founded, and these ideas that you talk about, the right to vote, it was a resolution made by the Congress party as early as 1938 that irrespective of property qualifications or educational qualifications, every adult Indian would be given a right to vote. And remember, at that time, this was not the case in the United States or in the United Kingdom. And so this is something that again was a political decision that was attributable to the political culture of the time. So what is critical to note is that constitutions emerge out of politics at any given point of time, and the politics that it emerged out of at that point of time was one of an emancipatory freedom movement. So it has captured some elements of that, the elements that you rightly mentioned of secularism, of citizenship, of everyone having a right to vote. These are parts that are captured. But other parts of the freedom movement have not been captured because they were seen as too radical. So let me give you an example. A good example of this is non-violence and satyagraha. Now, non-violence and satyagraha were Gandhiji's abiding slogans. This was perhaps the one uniting factor across our freedom movement, and perhaps it wouldn't be an overstatement to say that this was essentially the tool that got us freedom. But when it comes to the Constitution, if you look at the Constitution doesn't even mention the word satyagraha or non-violence. Now, to a constitutional lawyer like myself, that is entirely sensible, because this idea of satyagraha is a political tool, it's not really a legal doctrine and not a legal concept. Fair enough, I get that argument. But the point is that there were certain ideas, such as satyagraha, which were seen as too radical to incorporate in a legal text. So these were ideas that were not incorporated. The idea of duties, this was the idea that not only the Congress party, but several across the board this was an idea that they all championed. Now the idea of duties was not brought into the Constitution, then came in a very ham-handed fashion in the 42nd Amendment, which has given fundamental duties a very bad name. But these are ideas that we need to engage with, to think about how we can incorporate them constitutionally. Because as you said, we haven't had a tyrant, but if, God forbid, there ever was one, the fact is that that Constitution can be changed overnight. Without any difficulty. But what cannot change is the acceptability of the political culture. And I think that's the breeding ground of constitutions, and that's the business for you and me and every citizen in the country, and not just lawyers and judges.
Okay, so, for our audience here, to simplify and to say that, okay, you have a problem, and not a problem, but you say that it is colonial, okay? I just want to say that with respect to our constitution, like I said, we have had all of these rights that are there, and now you say that, okay, there should be duties as well, which we have, our fundamental duties. So, isn't it difficult to say that, like 1 billion people to follow a certain duty? So what would be your reimagination of these duties of citizens, since you've mentioned a lot about duties in your book? So what is your reimagination and the alternative that you would have had with respect to the constitution that we have today?
So I think first up, I don't have an alternative in terms of what duties should be incorporated, but I can certainly say that what it should not. So for example, the 42nd Amendment brought in some fundamental duties in the Constitution. Now those were duties that are primarily seen as duties to respect the national flag, to stand up during the national anthem. Now these are duties from citizen to the state. Now these are not the kind of duties that I have in mind. The kind of duties that I talk about are duties that citizens owe to each other. Because the idea is, as a nation, we cannot grow if we are always looking towards the state. We must look towards ourselves. And I live in the city of Delhi, which is a city that has particularly low on civic sense in this country, perhaps the worst. And I can see that we, as a society, and I'm equally culpable, that we don't owe duties to each other. I mean, and I think that's, and as a constitutional lawyer, and I see where your discomfort comes from, is that it's very difficult to say that, okay, how can we put it into a legal text? How can we make it enforceable? I don't have those answers. But I think it's certainly time to ask the question so that we do work on this. If we were to look at it academically, why is there such little good, rigorous academic work on the idea of duties coexisting with rights? This is something that we know of from Western jurisprudence, but we don't do any work in India India along those lines. So that is why currently whenever somebody talks of duties, and I have written this myself in my book, so what does this mean? That does it mean that everyone has a duty to join the military, and if we don't join the military we won't have a freedom of speech? These are all very frightening, if you were to think of it this way. But that's why what my book is urging people to think about ideas like duties, like decentralization of power, because I think those ideas are ideas whose time has come in India, because the large state itself will not be the guarantor of our liberties despite its best intentions.
But the decentralization of power is already happening, and we do have a Panchayati Raj institutions, and our constitution has been amended in order to incorporate this. Like now we have the Ministry of Panchayat, and we do have our autonomous district councils as well. So in a way, even though these things like such as Panchayati Raj have not been enshrined under the constitution in its inception, but later it was added and transformed. So that means that there are flexibilities within our constitution, and our constitutional lawmakers have made sure that our constitution is open-ended enough in order to allow more rights to be included under our constitution through the judiciary and through different political processes.
Absolutely, you're absolutely right. The 73rd and 74th amendments brought about in 92 and 93 did introduce Panchayati Raj and urban local bodies in the constitutional framework. Now in my view, this is a start, but certainly what we have now is not a genuine third tier of government. The reason why it's not a genuine third tier of government, with the exception of course, as you said, of district councils and autonomous hill councils, is because A, there is very little or no legislative power, B, there is very little money that these bodies have, because the bodies are completely dependent on state governments except for one or two exceptions like the Bombay Municipal Corporation, they are completely dependent on state governments for their finances. So my basic point here is that now 75 years on, we need to think about how much we can bring power closer to the people. Because there was a sense in the constitution, and there are good reasons for it, that power needed to be centralized in Delhi. And the reason for that was that we were undergoing a partition at that point of time, and we were worried that if we don't centralize power in Delhi, then states will go their own way and India will cease to exist. I think 75 years down the line, as in much of that has been put to rest. I don't think there is a serious fear of secession in this country. So we can't keep saying that unity demands that large amounts of powers are residing in Delhi. So for example, I mean, whether you talk about simple matters like you could see during the COVID-19 pandemic, as that what should be done at the central level and what should be done at the state level and what should be done at the local level. Now we need to think about how to empower local institutions to ensure that basic aspects of everyday life of citizens are dealt with at the local level. You're absolutely right. The constitution does have flexibility, and we have used that flexibility. But what my argument is that we must go much further down that line. This is not to say that denude the center of all powers, but let's try and see how we can bring power closer to the people.
So what model do you have then to bring power closer to the people? What would be the ideal model for you?
One would be, and I'm talking from a city perspective because I've studied cities, one would be empowered city governments. We need to have elected mayors. We need to have accountable mayors, and I'm not even talking about the city of Delhi, which I live in, because it's just a complicated basket case, but any other city. Because if you look at populations, let's look at populations in this country. India has a population of what, about 130 crores? That's more like a continent, because like the United States, Europe doesn't have a population that's as large. If you look at a state like, say, Bihar, I think that has a population of about 13 crores. I think Germany has a population of about 8 crores and Brazil has 5 crores or something like that. So, basically a state of Bihar is like a country. And then if you look at a medium-sized city, like say, Hyderabad, right? Okay, a metro city, but not in the top 4, as in that has a population slightly short of 1 crore. I mean, that's little bit short of New York State, so that's more like a state. So and if you look at a part of a city, like say high-tech city in Hyderabad, that is actually more like what a city is because it has about 20 lakh people. So what we need is that we need empowered governments in cities. I haven't studied the rural areas, so I won't be able to comment on that. But certainly we need to think about elected mayors who are more directly responsible to citizens of a city, need and need to be voted back into power. We can't think of having these powers far away and let me be perfectly honest. Devolving power comes with its problems. Okay. Again, coming back to my personal example, as in I live in an area where there's a residents welfare association, and the residents welfare association is as prejudiced as they come, right? So I can't think of giving more powers to them. So somewhere even I am happy that this power is instead exercised by some unnamed bureaucrat in the Municipal Corporation of Delhi. I'm happier with that because I don't know who this is, but I think this person doesn't have prejudice. But the answer really can't be that take power away and give it to someone you don't know. The answer, as we are maturing in our democracy, is that there must be better people in the Residents' Welfare Association. If I think so strongly about it, my friends and I should become part of the membership of part of the Secretariat of the Residents' Welfare Association. We have to try and ensure that we have better elected local government.
Okay. So another thing that I wanted to point out is that you say in your book that we have credited B.R. Ambedkar to be the main drafter of the Constitution. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you seem very upset at the fact that he's been given that reverence of being.
No, I'm not upset at all.
You're not upset at all.
Not upset at all.
All
because
right.
It's true. So I made this is a slightly more technical point. As in B.R. Ambedkar is undoubtedly the founding father of India's constitution, and there is no doubt about that. But what I meant to say, and it's written in the book, is that he is often credited as the chief draftsman of the constitution, and I think there are 3 myths here factually which need to be corrected without disrespecting Bhimrao Ambedkar in any way. The first is that he didn't write the first draft of the constitution. That first draft of the constitution was written by, as Badapbiang pointed out earlier, Benegal Narsingh Rao, who was the constitutional advisor, who traveled many countries, studied 60 constitutions, and drafted the first draft of the Constitution of India, number 1. Number 2 is that the chief draftsman of the Constitution, and this is B.R. Ambedkar's own words, was a gentleman named S.N. Mukherjee, who was a bureaucrat in the Secretariat of the Law Ministry, who was the actual draftsman of the Constitution. So that's the second myth. Third, the reason as to why these myths have perpetuated is because Ambedkar was the chairperson of what was called the drafting committee. Now the that has given rise to the impression that he alone drafted the constitution. Now the drafting committee was set up on the 31st of August 1947. First, there was already that first draft that was present. Secondly, what the drafting committee did was essentially they got all members of the House to agree on a consensus draft. So they looked at various reports, brought it all together, and they edited that first draft, revised it, and made it a draft that everybody accepted. So that task was a very critical task, and that task B.R. Ambedkar did superbly. And I think, but we must be clear on what he did do and what he didn't do, because in our reverence for him, we should not be peddling something that is untrue. The analogy that I've used, and this is, since it's a day of cricket today, I said that this was essentially like an innings which had been just played about 7 months before the constitution was drafted. It was 1949, where India was playing the West Indies at the Brabourne Stadium in Bombay, not Wankhede where we are playing today. And there, the match was drawn. It was a test match. It was drawn. We were 8 runs short of victory, but we couldn't win. And in that innings, we had solid contributions from our opening batsmen. We had in the middle order, and this is who I compare Ambedkar to, a centurion in Vijay Hazare, and there were several who held up the rear guard. And that is what our constitution framing exercise was like. It was a team effort which required everybody to play together, and Ambedkar was certainly the one who hit the century, but he was certainly not the only one on the team.
Of course, you are not discrediting the fact that, it was a team effort. And even B.R. Ambedkar himself had said that the credit that it gives to me does not really belong to me. It belongs partly to B.N. Rao, the constitutional advisor at that time. And he had also given credit to S.N. Mukherjee as well. Right. So it's not that he said that, I'm the only one who did it.
Yeah, he never said it. This is something that has happened over the last 40-50 years.
Yes, he was definitely a team player. And it's just like saying, okay, Mahatma Gandhi is the father of the nation. And but this is not to discredit and say that no, there aren't other freedom fighters. Of course, there were other freedom fighters. So I think I should have addressed this at the beginning, but I wanted to address the elephant in the room. When when this book came about, okay, before it was even launched, there was a picture of this book on Twitter. So I just wanted to address that. So when it came out, you received a lot of backlash because, there's a picture of the Union Jack or the flag of Britain, of the United Kingdom, and because you had named it the Colonial Constitution. So I just want to ask you, as an author, how did you deal with that backlash? And even for people without reading it, they had interpreted and said that, you just want the Constitution to be fully scrapped. So how did you deal with that? And do you really want the Constitution to be scrapped? Or what is your thoughts on that?
First of all, I think this is actually a good lesson for people to spend less time on Twitter and take Twitter less seriously, because I mean, if you were really bothered about Twitter, then I think you can't be an author. So most of the arguments that get made on Twitter are usually rubbish, as in they now are just provide some entertainment. So I think most of it could be brushed off quite easily. And in some sense, as in, this was expected and also something that that I entirely anticipated. And the reason for that is that people are quick to jump to conclusions in this day and age of social media. But when this, and while the cover was suggested by the publishers, as in I certainly went along with the cover, because of a very simple reason, is that I did want to provoke every person to think for themselves about the Constitution. And if they thought that this was the best thing ever, by all means say that it's the best thing ever. But if you think that there's something wrong, then hopefully you will also say that as well. And as far as my own view is concerned, do I consider that the Constitution should be scrapped? Not at all. I have written in the epilogue of this book that every generation has to think for itself about new constitutional ideals. So I certainly don't think that the Constitution should be scrapped. I have said that we live in an age of polarization, and any constitution that comes out of a time that is so polarized will not be long lasting. So this is not the time to write a new constitution. However, it doesn't mean that we sit pretty thinking that we've got a great constitution and our courts are going to protect us. I think that's also equally dangerous. So what I think every generation needs to do is that it needs to debate, think, discuss for itself about what constitutional ideals we need today. I have suggested a couple, like decentralization, reduction of police powers, and introducing the idea of duties coexisting with rights sensibly. But I think each one of us in this audience today should think for ourselves as to what is so important to us as being Indian today that should be in the Constitution. If it's there, great, let's support it, let's reiterate it. But if it's not there, then let's try and push for it to be included. And let's not fall into these labels, because we tend, in today's day and age, and I live in Delhi, that everything we tend to see as to, oh, is this going to support Modi or is this going to be against Modi? Okay, I don't see the world like that. And so if this means that there are some things that might support somebody, let it support somebody. But as long as we believe that this is something that we think the Constitution of India should have, then we should be bold enough to say it. Let Twitter be damned.
All right. So, I feel that it is also important to understand the thought process of a writer when writing a book, and to know the background of the writer, because most times when we read books, we are informed by the socio-economic, climate of the times. And so I would like to know, okay, in your book, in the last page, in page 216, you had mentioned, the Constitution creates a towering state that stifles individual initiative. It creates big governments that diminish the role of local communities. It gives citizens fundamental rights but hedges them with a slew of restrictions. At the same time, it spells out a clear vision of a more equal, secular, democratic India with free and fair elections based on universal adult franchise. So, as the director of Vidhi Center for Legal Policy, I'm sure you were very much involved in the drafting of the Dkhar Act 2016. So you talk about this towering state that stifles individual initiative, and at the same time, when it comes to the Dkhar Act, it seems to tower over citizens' right to privacy. And the Supreme Court, in the case of K.S. Puttaswamy, Justice K.S. Puttaswamy, had declared that the right to privacy is a part of Article 21, which is the right to life and personal liberty. So in that sense, you talk about this towering state, and yet then, you had drafted, helped in the drafting of that particular act. So do you have any comments regarding that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are certain things that the state has a role to play, and there are certain things that the state doesn't. So, in my view, as Badapbiang said, I helped in drafting the Aadhaar Act. I also defended the constitutionality of the Aadhaar Act in the Supreme Court, because I believe that the state has a role to play in delivery of welfare in the country. This is a role that the state has played, and this is a role that the state should continue playing in this country, where there are people below the poverty line to the extent that we have today. And what Aadhaar was trying to do was to have a more efficient way of delivering welfare. And I think that if there are more efficient ways that are possible of delivering welfare, we must do it, because we remember Rajiv Gandhi's aphorism, for every 1 rupee that the government of India spends, only 15 paise comes to the citizen. So if that 15 paise can be increased to whatever number, even if it is by 1 paise, and if technology can do that, then certainly that is something that the state should do, while of course not in any way trammeling our constitutional rights in a manner that is not permitted by the Constitution. And so the Supreme Court, as you rightly said, both declared the right to privacy as a fundamental right, and also declared that the Aadhaar program was in consonance with the right to privacy. And I think over the course of the last 12 years, the evidence speaks for itself. The welfare programs, particularly the DBT programs that the government of India and state governments ran during the COVID-19 pandemic, which allowed direct transfers to accounts of citizens, was seen as landmark anywhere in the world. And so I think that there is a role that the state has to play, and Aadhaar helped in playing that role. However, there is a role that the state need not play, and that is when I talked about preventive detention, when I talked about the law relating to sedition. I think these are parts of the colonial playbook that need to go. So it's not really always straightforward that the state shouldn't be there at all, and I can't be making that argument, but the state has its role, and I just think that delivery of welfare is a fundamental role of the state.
Okay, thank you for that answer. We are running short of time. We just have a minute left. And at least we can agree with one thing, that our constitution is time-tested and it has protected the rights of citizens. Although it may not be a perfect constitution, and we must be critical thinkers, but at the same time, we must also know our rights so that we can stand up for ourselves, and we have the judiciary to, not always protect us, but it is there to look after our, our fundamental rights. And we do have the power within us to question the government, to question this towering state, and we should not be afraid of that, because the Constitution gives us that power. All right, so thank you so much. It's been wonderful talking to you.